Hello everyone, my name is Universe Yamase. I'm bringing to you another Fourth Branch interview. Here with us today is Mr. Floyd Takeuchi. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Before we move on to the questions, I'd like to inform Mr. Floyd Takeuchi that these questions are taken from our viewers. They're taken either from our website, our email, or either given to us personally. So now that I've mentioned that, I'd like Mr. Floyd Takeuchi to give us a short background information about yourself.
I'm a journalist, and I've been a journalist mostly in the Pacific for going on 34 years. I got started in Guam, and I've worked in Hawaii, Japan, as well as in Fiji. Most of it in print, but also in broadcast too. And most recently in photography, where I'm doing books, mostly about the Pacific.
Wow. Great work. So now that he's given his short background information, now we can start with the questions. So the first question here with us today is, what inspired you to become a journalist?
I think everyone who is interested in journalism or wants to become a journalist has to have a sort of core values of being pretty nosy. You like to ask questions. Curiosity about what people do and why they do it. So that started me down the road, actually in high school, when I worked in the school paper, and then in college as an undergraduate degree in journalism to help focus my skills. But I was very fortunate in that when I came out of graduate school in the 1970s, and I did my graduate degree in Pacific Island Studies, that the Micronesian nations were just coming into their independence negotiations with the U.S. And so early in my career, I was able to cover a lot of that process, in particular the breakup of the unified Micronesia into separate governments and nations, the Marshall Islands, the FSM, and Palau.
So we know that you have some experience working in the Pacific region. What drove you to dedicate most of your work there?
Well, I've spent most of my life in the Pacific, and the Pacific Islands in particular. My parents are from Hawaii, but I was born and raised in the Marshall Islands, and the family lived on Saipan for actually over 20 years, and worked on Guam, and most of the subjects I'm interested in relate to the Pacific Islands. And so I've decided to just try to focus my work on that part of the world.
You've lived more than me back in the Pacific region.
Well, I have gray hair.
Well, you're also a photographer, and you've taken a lot of pictures. Among those pictures, what is your favorite one and why?
Asking a photographer what is his or her favorite photograph is like asking a parent who's the favorite kid. I think of it in terms of projects more than just all the photographs I've taken. So if I look at one of my most recent projects, which was about Xavier High School in Chuk in the FSM, there are two photographs that I like a lot. One of them is a black and white of 3 kids in a sophomore science class, and they're at a blackboard answering a question: what are the main elements of pelvic inflammatory disease? It was a unit on sexually transmitted diseases. And so if you look at the photograph, it's a horizontal. There are subjects for chlamydia, STDs, HIV. And for me, the photograph captures a lot about what's special about that school, of aggressive academics. The kids are pushing each other to be able to write the answers on the board. It's an old blackboard, so it's not very fancy technology, but they're learning a lot. And it's very contemporary issues that they're talking about.
Thank you. So moving on to the next question. You've been to so many islands in the Pacific. Which island has been most appealing to you?
There's no one place that I really like more than the others. They're all very special. I've been to nearly every Pacific Island nation over the past 34, 35 years. In Polynesia, I think I have a particular affection for the Samoas. They're very interesting. The nation of Samoa is probably the Pacific nation that most people should look to see how a well-run Pacific government would work. In Melanesia, I'm fascinated by the Solomon Islands. A very diverse population, beautiful place, a lot of history, a lot of it tragic history with war. And recently they had major riots there which burned down a good part of their capital city. But it's a nation with a lot of talent, and they're trying very hard to make it work. In the Western Pacific, that one's hard because they're all very different. I have a particular affection for the Marshall Islands, in part because I was born and raised there. Atoll life and issues are very different from the high islands of the FSM, mostly high islands. Palau is a unique nation, and I enjoy visiting and working in all of them.
Since you grew up most of your life in the Marshalls, is that where you'd want to settle or somewhere else?
I'm happy living in Hawaii.
Yeah.
It's a nice compromise. I can travel to the region pretty easily. I see a lot of folks from the region here, and it gives me a good base to do the kind of work that I do.
So you're all about media, and do you think media or news is very important to the government?
Well, absolutely. I don't think democracy can work without an active and strong news media. And fortunately, we're at a place now in history where, in the Western Pacific in particular, all of the governments have a fairly active news presence in some fashion. The Marshall Islands has had a wonderful newspaper, very active, very aggressive, since the 1970s. Palau now has three newspapers, mostly 2 or 3 times a week. Remarkable for a place that small. The FSM has been more problematic. It's been very difficult for the newspapers to survive there. And a lot of people have tried over the years. But the current newspaper, the Kasalelia Press, is a good effort. They need more resources, but so does everybody. And for with what they have, they do a remarkably good job.
So despite that FSM only has very few newspapers around, do you think it'll be very beneficial to FSM to have a media group around?
Well, they already have the Kasalelia Press, and I think they play a very important role in helping to keep the government honest.
Tact. Yeah.
And keep them on their toes, which is an important part of what journalists do. And the key part for FSM, I think, is to have a strong independent radio operation, which has never really been the case. The strongest radio has always been government radio for information. But since so many places don't have easy access to getting newspapers, the ships take a long time to get there or whatever, or the cost is so high, I think there's an opportunity for an important role for independent radio to play in the FSM.
Yeah, it's true. I know some states, like for example, Chuk and Pohnpei, they don't have, Chuk doesn't have newspapers going on right now, but they have radios.
Yes.
Radio going on.
And so it's important, particularly if you're in the outer islands, where you get maybe a ship every month or 2 months, to have a constant source of news, and radio would be the way to do it.
So the next question, among all the places you've been to, which country in Micronesia would benefit from good journalism?
Well, as I said, fortunately all of them have journalism in some fashion now. It would be great to see a newspaper in every state in the FSM. I don't think that's financially realistic, because independent papers are supported by advertising, and there's just not that much advertising. But the fact that there's the Kasalelia Press, which is distributed, is fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think that's very helpful. The Marshall Islands Journal plays an incredibly important role there in terms of its voice in the community. And in Palau, with 3 newspapers, you're going to get coverage of some kind.
So what advice would you give to young journalists in Micronesia?
It's a lot easier today to think about a journalism career than it was 30 years ago, before the internet. The fact that what you folks are doing with Fourth Branch is a really good example of how people with an interest in news, and you don't have to be formally trained to be a journalist, how can use technology to your advantage. This wasn't an option for people looking at journalism in the 70s, for example, or 60s. The first Micronesian who graduated with a journalism degree came out of Palau in the 60s. The first two actually came out of Palau. But they all ended up either working for like the Pacific Daily News briefly, or for the government, most of them. And while it's important to have good public information officers in government, they play an incredibly important role. Being a public information officer is not independent journalism, and it's good that there are more opportunities today.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's still the challenge of having being able to make a career out of it, because pay isn't that great. But at least there are opportunities today, and there's some very good journalists in the region. I mean, I can think of two in the Marshall Islands, for example, both Marshallese, Suzanne Chutaro and Doug Henry, who do great work week after week, and it's very encouraging to see that.
So with your understanding of the fourth branch, do you have any advice for them?
Well, I hope you can keep it up. I know it's a lot of work, particularly to do video, but and the expenses are pretty high. But I think you're playing a very important role. It's very creative, and I think there's some great opportunities to grow this news organization from where you are to go even further.
Yeah, there's great potential here.
Incredible potential, and I really admire the fact that you folks are doing this and taking it on.
Do you know any rising journalists in Micronesia that you know of?
Well, I mentioned the two in the Marshalls in particular. Suzanne Chutaro, whose family actually owns the newspaper, and she's going to be a long-term influence in journalism in the Western Pacific. Douglas Henry, who's a writer and photographer there, a Marshallese fellow, who does quite well. I wish the Kasalelia Press had more local journalists, but the fact that they're there and there's an opportunity to do that is great. And the editor, Bill Janes, who was one of my students in Tokyo when I had a project to train Pacific journalists in Japan for a special program, is a very good, hard-working journalist. And I hope that they can make it work financially so that there's a career path for Micronesians who want to go that route. It isn't easy, quite frankly. It's never been easy for Pacific Islanders to be journalists. Mm-hmm. It's always easier for those of us who are outsiders to come in, because we don't have family ties. There aren't issues of a clan.
Yeah.
There aren't issues of caste in some areas.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for young people to ask an older person, an authority, particularly if they're chiefly rank, questions that might make them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's easier for an outsider to do that because we're outsiders.
Yeah.
So that's always going to be a challenge for Micronesians looking to journalism, to get over the fact that they may be too young, or the wrong family in terms of that kind of issue, or the wrong caste. But if they push, I think the internet allows a great leveling of the playing field, and it's a great opportunity.
So, moving to the next question, we recently know that you just published your book called School on the Hill. So what is the purpose of that book?
When I decided to start producing books about the Pacific, it was with the idea that there are a lot of great stories out there that need to be told that aren't being told.